Hi, so this is the second part of the lecture on wind turbine failure. In the previous part, what we learned is a little bit about the construction of the wind turbine blades and the materials that are used for it and the common failures that occur. Okay, so now in this particular lecture, we are going to talk about the failures associated with the fibers. So mainly the material failures. So because the construction is from fiber reinforced plastics, so whether they are glass fibers or carbon fibers, there may be some issues of the compatibility between the fiber and the matrix material. That is one major problem, and that is why a lot of fiber related failures take place. Then there are some other issues, for example, because of the tensions, tension in the blades, the fibers can break, or because of the compression, the fibers can deform, and so on. So let's first talk about the fibers or the laminates in the hybrid structures. So, or hybrid materials. So these are hybrid composite materials which are sandwich structures. They have a core shell kind of geometry, and you typically have this very light core, and then you have on top of that you have certain layered materials or laminates. So in the previous part, in the previous slide, I was actually talking about how the delamination can happen between the hybrid material, between the core and shell of the hybrid material. So in this schematic, you can see how this delamination takes place. Okay. Now we talk about the cracks related to fibers. So the cracks in the composite material. Cracks parallel to the fiber direction. These are called splitting cracks, and this is how they look like. So generally, if you think about it, the fiber-based manufacturing is very different from traditional manufacturing. That is why all the manufacturing techniques that are used for composites are quite different from what are used for metals or isotropic materials, for example. So in the case of fibers, we are first making the fibers, then we are braiding the fibers, laying them in certain directions. We are braiding the fibers, and then we are ensuring that they are braided in a certain direction, that they have either parallel or perpendicular structures, and then now these sheets we take and we place them one on top of another, again at well-defined angles, and we infuse the resin between them. Now this entire process, if you look at an individual fiber, the fiber is actually very thin. It can be a few micrometer thin. The diameter of the fiber can be just a few micron. And an individual fiber is actually pretty weak and it can break. However, when we have these bundles of fibers, they are pretty strong. And even if a few fibers break, it does not really compromise the strength of your entire material or entire fiber structure. However, if certain cracks can propagate through the structure, then it is a problem. So in this schematic, you see that there is a long crack which splits the two fiber bundles. Such fiber cracks can propagate and then at some point lead to fracture. What else? You can have, as I mentioned, fiber breakage due to tension. If just a few fibers are broken, that is not a problem. However, if the entire bundles are broken, then that is a problem and we need to immediately take care of that. What can also happen is when a certain structure delaminates, then the edges, the fibers which are there at the laminate edges, they can break or they can get damaged because they are now exposed. So there's also fiber breakage due to delamination. Composite material fatigue. So composite materials also experience fatigue, but the mechanism of studying that, the mechanism of these fatigues is quite different compared to that of metals. So metals are isotropic material. What do we mean by isotropic material? The material has same properties in all directions, but this is not the same with composite materials, especially the fiber-based composite materials. Why? Because the fibers are laid out in a certain direction. So you will have different properties in that direction as compared to the other direction. So such materials are known as the anisotropic materials. And that is why the fatigue also, depending on the direction of the load, the fatigue properties will also differ. And also then it will depend whether you will have low cycle fatigue or high cycle fatigue, and that will determine your mechanism of failure as well. Okay, as I already mentioned that it is more complex to study the fatigue in composite materials because there are multiple damage mechanics that are taking place at the same time in parallel. Now let us talk a little bit about why do these fiber-based failures take place? What are the influencing factors? First of all, what type of fiber you're using, what type of matrix you're using. So there's a lot of optimization that goes into determining the interface properties of the fiber and matrix material, because the fiber and matrix need to be compatible. In fact, one of the issues with carbon fibers is the fact that the surface of carbon fibers can be very inert, and you may have to do certain treatment, chemical treatment of the surface in order to make it more compatible with the resin, with the matrix. Okay, so that this fiber matrix compatibility also determines your fiber distribution. However, the design of the composite can also determine the fiber distribution. For example, you may also have glass wool-like structures, fibers that are randomly oriented. However, you will not completely call it an isotropic material because you may have randomly oriented fibers, not braided fibers, but you still have a mat of these fibers which you're placing on top of a resin, and then another layer, and then another layer. So you ultimately have a laminate. So laminate does have a certain direction. The properties in plane and out of the plane will be different, but at the same time you do not have perfectly anisotropic material either. So the fiber distribution also plays a significant role in deciding what will be ultimately potential failure, what will cause the failure. Okay, as I already mentioned, the interface properties and also the infusion of the resin. So it is also the infusion of the resin also depends on how compatible, chemically compatible the both materials are, the fiber and the matrix material. So for example, I show here some braided fiber mats. So these are fiber bundles perpendicular to each other. Now we place a lot of resin. We pour a lot of resin into it. The question is this resin uniformly distributed and it is wetting all the fibers, or do we have certain air bubbles, certain areas where the resin could not reach? Another issue can happen that the resin reached everywhere, but when we are curing the resin, there are certain liquid spots. There are some defects when it comes to curing. So this is also one potential problem, and that is how the resin infusion can also play an important role when it comes to the strength of the overall material. And also the layer sequencing of the laminate contributes to the structure strength. At the end, there are loading conditions that determine how your material was actually converted into the blade and how each laminate was loaded. So all of these conditions together lead to different types of fiber failures.